Panel 2, Dr. Stephen Fienberg, Chairman of the National Research Council Committee to Review Scientific Evidence on the Polygraph.
Mr. Chairman, Senator
Please
Bingaman,
proceed.
I'm pleased to appear before you this morning. Accompanying me today is Dr. Paul Stern, who served as study director of the committee, and perhaps at a later occasion, if there are any questions that you want to direct to him, he'd be happy to answer.
Which one is he? Thank you.
Right here.
All right.
The committee's report, the polygraph and lie detection, which was released last October, as you know, reviewed the scientific evidence underlying the use of polygraphs for security screening of employees at the national laboratories, and it also considered the potential alternatives to polygraph testing for the detection of deception. And my testimony today is based on that report. The written testimony that I submitted to the committee earlier this week was prepared before I was aware of what Deputy Secretary McSlero would say this morning. He did have the courtesy to call me yesterday evening, so I did have some advance notice, but I didn't have an opportunity to change the document, and I probably will for the record. I should note that when somebody gives 2 years of his scientific life, which is what our committee members essentially did, to an enterprise like the activities of our committee, one typically looks for a response, and the response we saw in April was not exactly one that was heartening. After 2 years of effort to be told that there would be no change in policy was not something that the committee reacted positively to. I think it's fair to say. I'm very gratified by the reaction evidenced in the Deputy Secretary's testimony today, and I'll try to meld some of my written comments with responses to my understanding of what is there. Our report begins by setting the context of the current discussion over the efficacy of polygraph testing in the context of the mystique that surrounds it. This includes a culturally shared belief that the polygraph is nearly infallible, often evidenced by the kind of ideas associated with Wonder Woman and her magic lasso. When someone was caught in the magic lasso, they were forced to tell the truth. So the notion that the polygraph really had that impact is widely shared among those who really don't know much about it. As we note in the report, the scientific evidence strongly contradicts this belief. There were 5 key conclusions in our report, and let me just summarize them briefly. The scientific evidence supporting the accuracy of the polygraph to detect deception is intrinsically susceptible to producing erroneous results. 2, in populations of naive examinees, and I want to emphasize the word naive, untrained in countermeasures, specific incident polygraphs can discriminate lying from truth-telling at rates well above chance, though well below perfection. The accuracy of the polygraph in screening situations is almost certainly lower. Third, basic science gives reason for concern that polygraph test accuracy really can be degraded by countermeasures. Fourth, the scientific foundations of polygraph screening for national security are weak at best and insufficient to justify reliance on its use in employee security screening in federal agencies. And then last, some potential alternatives show promise, but none has been shown to outperform the polygraph, and none is likely to replace it in the short term. In April of this year, when the Department of Energy released the new draft regulations on its polygraph testing program of 8 classes of federal employees and contractors, its new regulations proposed to continue a policy that was set in place in 2000, but suspended pending the report of our committee. So it might be natural to ask what was in the report of direct relevance to the proposed regulations. The specific wording in the matter of security screening is worth repeating. Polygraph testing yields an unacceptable choice for DOE employee security screening between too many loyal employees falsely judged deceptive and too many major security threats left undetected. Its accuracy in distinguishing the actual or potential security violators from innocent test takers is insufficient to justify reliance on its use in employee security screening in federal agencies. The original regulations proposed in April paid only lip service to our conclusions and recommendations. The written document that I submitted earlier this week makes this clear, but I'd like to try to highlight the major changes I see as a consequence of today's testimony of the Deputy Secretary and how they square with our report. I made a list of 6 key changes in the department's position. 1, do fewer tests. That has 2 components. Do testing of restricted groups in highly classified settings. And with this is a definition, a new definition of what should be top secret. And secondly, random screening, something I'll come back to. I want to note that although there are fewer tests, there's still a lot of tests. And with the large number of tests, we still get the attendant false positives and false negatives. The second change is do less with the results of the tests. Although it wasn't in his oral testimony, in the written testimony, Deputy Secretary McSlaro talked about treating the results as more akin to anonymous tips than definitive evidence of deception. I think that if the department got an anonymous tip about an employee, it would not lead to a full-bore investigation. And so I think that there is still something to be worked out here. There is clearly a problem with a positive test result because there is not a backup test. Once somebody tests positive on a polygraph, there is nothing that science has to offer for the department and the security program to do as a follow-up test. Doing another polygraph is simply not good enough. There is a second component to this change of doing less, and that is that there should be no adverse decision on access based solely on the results of the polygraph. But and also a recommendation to rely on the polygraph less for accelerated clearance. This is important in light of the false negative problem. I said I wanted to come back to random screening. That was my third item. This is random screening for deterrence. And I want to emphasize that in our review of the literature on the polygraph, we found no scientific evidence in support of the deterrent effect of the polygraph. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's that we have never done a serious investigation of it, and especially deterrence for possible spies. The Deputy Secretary, this is my fourth point, talked about anecdotal reports of admissions. We, in the course of our deliberations, heard many anecdotal reports. We never received written documentation that would allow us to assess them carefully or to put them in context where their scientific usefulness could be assessed. Point 5, do more research. I can only applaud the Deputy Secretary's support for our position on this. He suggested in the written testimony that we don't know much about the polygraph, but I want to say that we do know something about its limits. And they suggest that it simply isn't up to the task that we have before us. We shouldn't expect to make the polygraph better, but we should look for better approaches. In the original response to our report, the DOE continued to rely on polygraph screening as before, and in doing so was doing more for the appearance of security than for the reality. The new proposals rely far less on the polygraph, but our committee made clear that while that was the case, we simply should not believe that the polygraph was going to be the answer in the future. And while some potential alternatives show promise, none has led to scientific breakthroughs in lie detection. So we can't look for a short-term fix to aid our quest for securing the nation and its secrets. The labs need a strong security program, not a false sense of security. There are better alternatives than maintaining the current polygraph policy, even in its revised form. Last year, the DOE got 2 reports, our report and one from the Commission on Science and Security, the so-called Hamry Commission report. And it recommended management and technological changes at the labs that could make unauthorized release of national secrets more difficult to conduct and easier to detect without relying on the polygraph or other methods of employee screening, all of which are seriously limited and have little or no scientific base. So while there still may be a place for polygraph testing in the labs, for investigations and for small numbers of individuals with access to the most highly sensitive classified information, if the test's limited accuracy is fully acknowledged. And this is what the DOE is now proposing to do, at least in part. The question is, how limited? In his statement today, Deputy Secretary Mislero suggests he agrees with the committee that the broad use of this flawed test for screening will probably do more harm than good, and we believe that national security is too important to be left for such a blunt instrument. Let me just conclude by reminding you that polygraph testing rests on weak scientific underpinnings despite nearly a century of study. Much of the available evidence for judging its validity lacks scientific rigor, and our committee sifted that evidence, and the report makes clear the limitations of the polygraph for the present context. Searching for security risk using the polygraph is not simply like a search for a needle in a haystack. It is true that of the large group of people being checked, only a tiny percentage of the individuals examined may be guilty of the targeted offenses. Unfortunately, tests that are sensitive enough to spot most violators will also mistakenly mark large numbers of innocent test takers as guilty. And tests that produce few of these types of errors, such as those currently used by the DOE, will not catch the most major security violators, and still will incorrectly flag truthful people as deceptive. Both kinds of errors. Thus, the haystack analogy fails to recognize that unacceptable trade-off I mentioned earlier in my testimony. Our committee concluded that the government agencies could not justify their reliance on the polygraph for security screening. Today's testimony and the new proposals seem much more consistent with the scientific evidence. As a nation, we should not allow ourselves to continue to be blinded by the aura of the polygraph. We can and we should do better. And the NRC, and I think the members of our committee, look forward to the possibility of working with Mr. McSlero as the DOE refines its new proposals. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer your questions and amplify on these comments.
Dr. Fienberg, thank you very much. Thanks to you and all those who worked with you for an excellent effort in behalf of your country. And I'm pleased that in this instance, it's obvious that you have had a significant degree of success already. It didn't take a long time. We got it today. I'm sure it needs refinement, and I suggest that they continue to work with you if you all are willing to work with them as they attempt to refine it. I'm most interested in how the laboratory employees, the people that we worked so hard in behalf of, because we were worried about their morale and their efficiency and other things. I'm kind of worrying now about what their feelings are going to be, and we can't find that out for a while. It's going to have to go out there and be tested and see what the employer can do with reference to their program. I hope you get a chance to review those results also from time to time. Your report noted that there might be better technologies than the polygraph for detecting truthfulness. I've been particularly interested for a completely different reason in brain imaging technologies. In particular, or specifically, I have had a long history of concern with the MEG, magnetoencephalography technology, encephalography. That's also a creature of this one of the laboratories, Los Alamos. It's a mighty technology that when tentacles are affixed to the skull, there are brain wave reverberations that come out, and now that we have the computer capacity that we have, we get images that are able to be read in a manner beyond anything we could do before, in fixed time pictures of brain reaction. I'm not scientific enough to be suggesting that it will have a role, because it might have no role just because it's too bulky. But I note that you're interested in new technologies, and I wondered if, to your knowledge, has MEG been studied for use in lie detection, and do you think it might offer a promise? And what other technologies might there be, Doctor?
I confess I probably would have had the same difficulty to pronounce the full name of Meg, and I'm not sure I fully understand the details of that technology. There are some related technologies that the committee did have an opportunity to study a bit. That is, we studied available evidence. One of these is referred to as brain fingerprinting, which does involve recordings from the scalp in much the same way you described, and something called the P300 wave. And there have been several of these studies. What the committee's report notes is that the nature of what is being measured in the P300, or the so-called brain fingerprinting technique, is much more focused and useful for specific incident situations. And we were very hard-pressed to understand the extent to which it would be useful for security screening purposes. We, in fact, spoke with one of the foremost proponents of that technique, and I believe he agreed with us about the relative value of it. The other area that's brain-related is the use of functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. I can pronounce that one. And we actually had occasion to review 3 different studies, 2 published and 1 unpublished, on fMRI. It turns out that we're not very far in the use of that kind of technology. The 3 studies did detect the ability of fMRI to distinguish deception from truth-telling better than chance. So there's something there. But unfortunately, they discovered the part of the brain that seemed to be most helpful in this was different in the 3 studies. That, unfortunately, doesn't help us move rapidly ahead with a program in that area.
He said he was using FM. Incidentally, not that it makes a bit of difference, but the fMRI is currently being used by hooking it together with an MEG, and the results are rather fantastic. Only in that you can now get real-time pictures of the brain. Not slices, but real-time pictures, which is going to be a fantastic device if applied to schizophrenia in sufficient test mode. You might find how the brain actually changes and moves with reference to diseases like that. Whether it's ever going to help in this area, I just threw it out here today just to show you I knew something. And if you will please let me leave and hold me excused, I'm going to turn it over to Senator Bingaman and thank you, and thank him for his consistent and persistent work in this regard, and hope that you get your wish that we not only do what the Secretary said today, but we do better, and that a broader array of institutions find out about Polygraph through you and through this, and don't use it in other areas either where it is obviously being used beyond our laboratory employees. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Let me just ask a couple of questions before we end the hearing. Let me just summarize what I think your committee has said, and I join Senator Domenici in thanking you and the committee members for the good work you've done here. I think it's very important, and I think it will have impacts on the use of polygraphs throughout the government. I hope that's the case, and I believe it is. As I understand it, you've concluded that in trying to detect the difference between deception and truth-telling, polygraphs can be a useful tool where you have a particular investigation that you are pursuing related to a particular individual or group of individuals, that there is a higher incidence of accuracy in the use of a polygraph under those circumstances than there is when you're trying to use it to screen a large group of individuals to see whether they're engaged in anything improper. Is that a fair summary of what you concluded?
I think that that's reasonably correct.
Okay. Now, what the Secretary, or what the Deputy Secretary today has advised us is that he's become persuaded after reading your report that the broad use of the polygraph for screening is not appropriate. Broad meaning as broadly as they were previously using it. And therefore, they're going to reduce the number of people who are subjected to polygraphs, and they're going to reduce the extent to which they rely upon the results of those tests, but they're going to continue to use it for screening, just as they have in the past, just do so in fewer cases. Is that your understanding, essentially, of what they've concluded?
That's correct.
And based, the difference of opinion, which still exists between your committee's conclusions and what the department's doing, is they are continuing to use it as a screening tool where you believe that the scientific evidence does not support that.
That's correct. In the report, we did make reference to the potential usefulness if there were truly a deterrent effect.
But you have no evidence that there is a deterrent
But
effect.
we have no evidence, and I think it's fair to say that there was a spectrum of opinion on the committee ranging from those who believed that there was a deterrent effect, although it was impossible to quantify, through to those at the other end of the spectrum who believed that there was no effect whatsoever.
And when you say deterrent effect, what kind of deterrent are you talking about? Are you talking about deterring people who are spies from seeking employment in these jobs, or are you saying this would deter people who might consider engaging in some kind of disloyal activity from doing so, or what are you thinking about?
That's a wonderful question, because I think it's fair to say that we were not very explicit about what it meant. And indeed, when people refer to the deterrent effect, they are rarely explicit about what behaviors it's in fact deterring. I think there's a belief that both of the kinds of circumstances you described would be lumped together, but I don't think people are explicit because they have nothing to rely on when, in fact, they talk about that. In fact, the thing that I would emphasize is that in many ways, and this goes back to your first question, where you began, the polygraph is an interrogation tool. It's not a tool to learn about truth-telling. And as an interrogation tool, it can deter people from engaging in activities because they may be afraid to be interrogated about them. And so it's in that sense that people typically talk about deterrence. But ultimately, the utility, we also noted, depends on whether or not there's any scientific basis for the detection of deception. And as people learn the truth, and it wasn't simply our committee that blew the whistle on the polygraph, people have been saying this for a long time, it's simply not appropriate in these circumstances for large-scale testing. And so the question is, what's large scale, I think, at this point?
Let me just ask a final question about this Atomic Energy Commission